Hello, and welcome to today's reflection on the first chapter of Ruth. Our daughter-in-law Lily sent us a WhatsApp this morning. It said, "We're not going to Hawaii for our holiday this year because of COVID-19. It is better than last year's reason when we just couldn't afford it." Well, we usually travel to another country for a couple of weeks for pleasure, to explore, rest and relax. Sometimes it's for work, but rarely because of famine or other dangers. And this is where the book of Ruth begins, as there was a famine in the land. And reflecting on the first chapter, there are three things which stand out for me. Firstly, migration. Secondly, grief. And thirdly, faith. So firstly, migration. The land around Bethlehem was fertile and so good for growing barley that the name Bethlehem, which means house of bread, reflects the usually abundant harvest. We do not know how long the famine had lasted, but it must have been severe for Elimelech to decide to uproot and take his family to a foreign land. Unless you've chosen to make a life-changing move to another part of the world, you have to be desperate to leave your home, your family and friends, and the security of all that you've known at a time of suffering and uncertainty. You are forced into leaving because there was no other option. The family's situation reminds me of a poem called Home by Warsan Shire, who was born in Kenya to Somali parents and lives in London. She wrote this poem to highlight the harsh reality of what it is to be a refugee in Europe today. The poem goes, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. It's not something you ever thought about doing. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." That last line always disturbs me, and people are so desperate as still to risk their lives on overloaded boats. And Elimelech must have been desperate, especially as he chose Moab. It was only 50 miles to the southeast of Bethlehem, but why on earth would anyone go to Moab? At that time it was a strange choice, as the people were dangerous and couldn't be trusted. And in the past the Moabite women had undermined Jewish families, and the Jewish men were encouraged to marry Jewish women. There was even a law which said that Moabites could not be part of the local Jewish congregation. And yet amongst these dangerous people, Naomi and her sons find hospitality. And after Elimelech dies, they stay on in the country. And this is a reminder that we can find hospitality in the strangest of places, and often when we least expect it. It's a lesson for us to offer hospitality to the stranger, but also a lesson to be willing to accept hospitality from those whom we do not know. Years ago, I had to visit a family about a bereavement. They lived just outside of the village, and when I asked someone how to find their home, the person replied that the family were what we'd call a bit rough and ready. And when I sat in that family's living room, I could see what my source of information meant, but accepted a cup of tea out of a grubby mug and hoped for the best. When it was nearing the time for me to leave, I wondered whether or not I should offer them a prayer, as was my usual practice. I thought there was no point actually, as they wouldn't want one. But then again I thought that I just ought to offer, which I did. And to my surprise, they accepted, and afterwards asked me to come and pray with them again. Our relationship deepened at that moment, and there was a warmth between us which there wasn't before the prayer. We truly can find hospitality in the strangest and least expected places. And this is a very small and minor example, but it taught me never to judge people and make assumptions about them. In recent weeks, we've been confronted with the importance of accepting all people who are different from us. Black Lives Matter. Here again is a reminder of the importance of living alongside people who are different from us, and how we can find hospitality in the strangest of places. We do not know what Naomi thought of her sons marrying Moabite women, but after their deaths she had 2 daughters-in-law who stay with her. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem with Orpah and Ruth, and so they set out for the land of Judah. On the way, they stop. When Naomi arrived in Moab, she was full with a husband and 2 sons. Now, although she has 2 daughters-in-law, she is empty. Elimelech took Naomi and the family to Moab to escape death, and it is there that he and his sons died. So secondly, this chapter tells us of the women's grief. Naomi tells Orpah and Ruth to return to their families. She kissed them, and they wept aloud. Their tears could be the result of the thought of their parting, or wrapped up with their mourning for their dead husbands and sons. Once the tears have subsided, the Moabite women tell Naomi that they will go with her to her people. Naomi asks them to return to their families again, and then they wept aloud again. And these tears on the road show us the importance of grief. When someone dies, we need to mourn and let grief take its course, which often involves anger, guilt, and many other natural emotions. I shall never forget my maternal grandfather's funeral, as throughout the service and the refreshments afterwards, my grandmother was totally at peace and in fact beaming. Whilst many of us grandchildren were emotional wrecks, she was smiling and saying things like, "Don't be sad, dear. Grandad has been waiting for this his whole life, to be with his Lord." As Christians, we know that death has lost its sting and that Jesus has conquered death. Death is part of the journey into eternal life. There's nothing to fear and a cause for rejoicing. We know this in our minds, but that will not stop us missing our loved ones when they die. It's natural to weep. Jesus wept for his friend Lazarus. And it was later, after Grandad's funeral, that Gran wept and missed him terribly, along with the rest of the family. This time of grieving and mourning is so important. Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth needed to weep just as we do. I was reflecting on this when I was thinking about all the people who have died because of the coronavirus, and all those who have died of other causes during this time. It concerns me that people have not been able to grieve and mourn, as few people have been allowed to attend funeral services or have refreshments afterwards. People have not been able to kiss loved ones or be with them before they died. Doctors, nurses and care workers have done wonderful things to ensure that people have not died alone. And that's been a great comfort to family and friends. But so much of the natural grieving process has been denied people. Jane, Hannah and I are great fans of Gareth Malone and love watching him draw music and emotions out of people through singing. And when we settled down to see his latest work done virtually with people through this time of lockdown, we should have been prepared for the tears caused by the song produced by a care worker, a student nurse and a doctor in the first episode. The singers focused on the reality of what they were doing on the front line in the work looking after people with coronavirus, and they just let the raw emotions out as they faced up to the reality of what they were doing. We all, of course, need to encourage each other, keep cheerful and have a good laugh, but we also need to recognise the need to weep. We have all lived with the stiff upper lip approach to life, which is all very well, but can be harmful to our health to keep our emotions bottled up inside. It's all right to feel low and admit having a bad day. You don't have to keep smiling all the time. You can weep and feel frustrated. You can feel anger, guilt and sorrow and all the other 101 emotions we go through at various times. We have to keep doing what we can to overcome the coronavirus and be optimistic. We need encouragement as the restrictions of lockdown are gradually eased, but we mustn't forget the need to grieve and mourn. Soon more than 45,000 people will have died because of the COVID-19 here in the UK. That's a huge number of families and friends who need to mourn. And I was thinking about this when in Wednesday's newspaper I read an article about the need for a national time of mourning. It's going to be a few minutes on Saturday night. But we mustn't let all those who have died be forgotten as life returns to the new normal. When we return to our churches to worship, we look forward to celebrating and thanking God for bringing us through this time. But we also need to mourn and allow people to grieve for those who have died and recognise how we really feel. Thinking about Naomi, Orpah and Ruth's grief could not be timelier. Thirdly, we reflect on what this chapter tells us about faith. Some scholars say that Elimelech turns his back on God by going to Moab, where the people worshipped Chemosh. Little is known about the Moabite religion except that it did involve human sacrifice. We learn that Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem after she heard that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. There was now food in Judah, not because the rains had come or there'd been a bumper harvest, but because the Lord had provided it. This is the first of only 2 times in Ruth when God is reported to have acted. Otherwise, God is there in people's lives, but in the background, working behind the scenes. Naomi must have kept her faith in Yahweh and now felt was the time to return to her people. When Naomi, Orpah and Ruth stop on the way and Naomi tells them to return to their mother's homes, she prays for them and asks for God's blessing upon them. She still believes in God as she turns to him to express her love and care of her daughters-in-law. She prays that the Lord will deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Naomi wants God to bless them with the deep loving kindness which they have shown her. She continues to pray, "The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." In the society of the time, widows were extremely vulnerable and relied upon male family to protect them and look after them. Our psalm today praises God for looking over the widows. Orpah and Ruth would find security if they remarried. Perhaps Naomi realizes that they were unlikely to find husbands in Judah, as the Jewish men wouldn't want to marry foreigners, and especially not Moabite women. Alternatively, Naomi may not would have wanted to arrive back in Bethlehem with Moabite women in tow, and so have to explain what they were doing with her. However, the prayer suggests that she is thinking of Orpah and Ruth's poor prospects in Bethlehem, and so wants the best for them. Naomi is showing her trust in God and his loving kindness. When the daughters-in-law refuse to leave Naomi, she makes it clear that there are no brothers and there will not be any for them to marry. After weeping, Orpah kisses Naomi goodbye and returns to her people and her gods. Often Orpah has been considered to be the unvirtuous one and Ruth the heroine. Orpah, however, does what Naomi tells her to do, and so is the obedient one. Ruth, however, clung to Naomi and committed herself to go with her to a new place, to live with her amongst her people, worship her God, and even be buried away from Ruth's homeland. These are really big steps, and this passage has been abused in the past and still is in some places, to argue that when people seek refuge or move to a foreign country, they should lose their own identity and integrate themselves with the local people in that place. It's been used to treat people as second-class citizens and outsiders. However, Ruth is not saying that she'll give up her identity, and that's made clear later in the book as she's often referred to as a Moabite. Ruth also committed herself to God, which suggests that she did give up her old religion. Perhaps she was willing to do this as she'd seen something of what it was like to be part of the people of God in Naomi. We can only read between the lines, but Naomi showed something of the loving kindness of God to Orpah and Ruth, which was why they were kind to her after Mahlon and Chilion had died. Perhaps Ruth had heard Naomi telling the stories of the people of God as they gathered as a family. Maybe she'd seen Naomi's faith shining through her everyday life, especially when life got tough and she was dealing with the death of her husband and sons. God often uses others in times of difficulty to point others to himself. And Ruth must have seen something in Naomi and her faith to make her want to stay with her, committing herself to her. Ruth is a model of commitment, and Naomi's a model of living out our faith. Through her example, Ruth wants to follow and worship God. All that Ruth knows about Yahweh, the God of Israel, is what she has learnt and seen in the life of Naomi. Naomi reminds us that for many people, only learn about Jesus and see him in our lives as we follow him and reflect his light. I'm sure that we all know people who've helped us see what Jesus is like as we've experienced their love and care for us. The loving kindness of which Naomi speaks and lives is of course the love which Jesus shows us and commands us to have for one another. As Jesus says, people are known by the fruit, and so we, the followers of Jesus, are known by our fruit of love. As the first letter of John says, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. This loving kindness which Ruth sees in Naomi brings her to trust in God. We might not be going to Hawaii this year because of COVID-19, but reflecting on the book of Ruth, Elimelech must have been desperate to take his family into a dangerous place like Moab. Desperate people are still taking their families into dangerous places to find a place of safety and a place to call home. As the country begins to open up again into the new normal, we need to find time and allow people a safe space in which to give thanks to God, but also to grieve, weep and mourn, just as Naomi, Orpah and Ruth needed to do on the journey to Bethlehem. And just as Ruth committed herself to trusting God, so we need to continue to trust in Jesus, and like Naomi, show his loving kindness through the way in which we live our lives, treating all people with loving kindness and respect. The chapter begins with Elimelech and family leaving Bethlehem during a famine, and ends with Naomi and Ruth returning at the beginning of the barley harvest. We might be feeling starved of human contact, but we're at the beginning of being able to meet again. With Naomi and Ruth trusting in God in Bethlehem at harvest time, the scene is set to see how God will provide and reveal his loving kindness to them. But that's another chapter for another day. Amen.